All right, so this is the first video for week 7, and what we're going to be doing this in this session is, or this video, is talking about perspective. And perspective is a funny word. In the English language, it has a lot of different meanings. But here's a comic or a cartoon from created by Johnny Hart. It's called BC. I don't know if you've ever read that comic before, but I remember reading it when I was a kid. But I think this cartoon pretty much illustrates what we mean by perspective, at least in the context of photography. And it has to do one of the tricks that artists use to make things appear to be further off in the distance. And usually the trick is make things smaller. And this cartoon, the whole joke is that the perspective rules are being completely broken, and as the guy walks near the person reading, the size doesn't change. So I think that's the kind of perspective that we're talking about. There's a definition for it. The art of drawing solid objects on a two-dimensional surface so as to give the right impression of their height, width, and depth. So basically, it's drawing things to make them appear the way that they really appear to us in real life. And there's all kinds of different tricks to do that. There's different types of perspective. I'm just going to turn the volume down on my phone here. How awkward to have that happen while I'm doing a video. Anyways, if you look at this diagram here, this is from a textbook that we used to use in this program. And if you take a look at it, it's illustrating 3 different types of perspective, or 3 ways that we can describe perspective. And it's flat, normal, and steep. And if you take a look at flat, that's your typical telephoto, everything's compressed kind of a look. And then on the other extreme is what they might call steep perspective, where things in the foreground look really big and things in the background look really small. And then somewhere in the middle is this normal perspective. When I was a student, we talked about this stuff, but we never really used the words flat and steep. We used spatial compression and spatial expansion. Normal always stayed the same, but spatial compression seemed to make things look compressed, and spatial expansion meant everything looked like it was far away or very far apart. So the only way to really appreciate some of this stuff is just to look at some different diagrams and see kind of what we mean by spatial expansion and compression. And if you look at this image here, the door looks like it's small and it's really far away. It looks like you could walk a long distance to get to that door. Compare that to where this image, which is showing us spatial compression. And it looks like if you stand in front of this arbor here, the door is right there and you don't have very far to walk. I have a project for you. And rather than me blabber on all about perspective, and I'm actually going to talk a bit more about it, I want you to do an assignment. And the assignment is very similar to something that Ben Long did in one of his videos, but instead of using a person, you're going to photograph a car. And I've got a separate video where I talk about the images that I want you to capture. But basically, you're just going to find a car and you're going to photograph it 5 times. And I've put the steps in here in excruciating detail. But just watching my other video will probably walk you through it. The main thing, though, is after you're done taking the pictures, and you'll have to submit them on FOL, the main thing is for you to answer the questions. And there's only 2 of them. The first one is really simple. It asks, what caused that change in perspective? And so I just want to clarify something here. If we were to look at these 3 pictures, I want to know what caused this picture to look different than that picture. Another question I might ask is, what made this picture of the house look different than that picture of the house? What is causing that change in perspective? And I'm going to give you a clue. If you look in the question, I even tell you it can only be one of 2 things. It's either the lens that you used, or it's the distance of the camera from the subject. So it's one of those two. Only one is the right answer, so which one is it? So it looks like there's a lot of space there to write, and this is a PDF that you can download and you can type into. So when you get this on your computer, don't feel like you've got to fill that space. All you have to do is answer one or the other. That's it. If you feel like typing, save that for question number 2. This is where I want you to explain, how did you get your answer for number 1? How did you come to this conclusion? What was it about the photos that made you come to that conclusion? So that's the important part that I want you to, figure out and explain in your own words. And just so you know, if you might recall from the last assignment, when you type stuff out and you write your answer and you try to explain how you came to your conclusion, spelling and grammar matter. There's a big push in the education in colleges and universities everywhere to keep reinforcing good grammar and good spelling. So take your time, proofread, check for spelling, check for grammar, punctuation, and all that stuff. So let's talk a little bit about perspective a little bit and just how does it work? How is it that we're getting images that look unusually large in the foreground and surprisingly small in the background? How is all that happening? Take a look at this diagram here. I try to simplify things as much as possible. Let's pretend that these 2 bars, one's red and one is blue, are buildings. So you're walking around Toronto and you see these 2 buildings that are the same size, same height, and you look at them and go, oh, okay, hey, look, one is behind the other. You can see both. And so you go ahead and you take a photograph. And if you were to look at or follow the path from the top of those buildings to the camera, you'll notice that the light is coming from a slightly different angle, actually a pretty drastic angle. And what's really important is the top of this building is going to look like, if you follow that path, like it's the same height as this part of the building. So what I'm showing you in this diagram over on the right-hand side is what you're going to see in the camera. So you're standing here, you see 2 buildings that you know are the same height, but because of the relationship between the distance from here to the first building and from your camera to the second building, what you'll end up seeing is the one building in the background is going to look a lot smaller. And you'll see when you photograph the car that the front wheel will be really big compared to the back wheel. The front of the car is going to look much larger than the back of the car. If you back up and move your camera further away and draw those same lines, kind of showing the viewpoint from the camera, you can see that the intersection point is now in a slightly different location. And now, when you look at what those buildings are going to look like, you're going to see they start getting closer and closer in height. And if we were to back up even further and just keep on backing up, eventually we'd probably get to the point where those 2 buildings appear to be the same height. So that's how this whole perspective issue, or this is how distance is impacting the perspective and how things appear to our eye and how they appear to our camera for that matter. So this faraway shot, you'll see will look similar, aligns with the image you'll take of the car with a telephoto lens from really far away. So those are the 2 different perspectives that are achieved by changing the distance, getting close and getting far away from the car. So that is kind of how perspective works. And some of you are probably thinking, who cares? What does this got to do with me running around taking pictures with my camera? Why do I have to worry about whether it's distance or lens choice? How is that going to affect me or you when you're out there taking pictures? Well, there are some real life problems that are solved by knowing how perspective works. And I'm just going to give you an example. So this is one of my photos from when I was primarily a wedding photographer. And I'm just going to have to set this up a little bit. If you take a look at this shot, you can see, there's the bride and the groom, and I think that's the bride's parents there. And this is one of those classic scenarios where people always say, hey, we have a great location for pictures. This is a beautiful garden. And when I get there, I realize that's not a very big garden. And we actually have a very small area to take pictures in. So we're using this tree as a background. And you can see there's a brick wall. And there's some windows over here. And I usually try to avoid getting doors and windows in my shots. I always find them a little bit distracting. I don't mind the brick too much, but windows I just don't like having, and sometimes you get reflections in them and all that kind of stuff. So here I am, I'm a certain distance away. I take a picture of the 4 people, and that's just great, okay? And there's a sort of, I try to create a little diagram to illustrate kind of what's going on. And there's the camera, there's my angle of view, and you can see I've positioned myself so that I'm avoiding a door that is right there. And I'm just getting a little bit of the window. So suddenly the group gets bigger. So mom and dad leave, and some of the bridesmaids come in, or friends of the bride, and now it's a bigger group. But even though it's a bigger group, if you notice on the left-hand side, we actually lost the window. And everything actually looks a little bit more compressed. There's that spatial compression that we were talking about earlier. So what has happened here for me to make this shot possible? Well, just take a look at this diagram. Here's this is exactly the same diagram from the previous shot, and I've added the extra people. So what I could do is just zoom out and use a wider angle of view, or switch over to wide angle and have a wider angle of view. But if I do that, keep my camera in the same spot and just go for a wider, and I could zoom out, my lens goes to 24 millimeter, I could easily fit all those people in the shot. But if I do that, I'm gonna get the door in the shot, I'm also gonna get all the windows in the shot. And if you look at the photo, you clearly see that I was able to avoid that. So how did I solve that problem? I backed up. In fact, I got really far. I backed up. There was a road right here, and I had to go on the other side of the road to take it's not a road, it's kind of a driveway thing. And I had to go on the other side in order to get this shot, because I didn't want the windows and I didn't want the doors in the shot. I wanted to have a nice, clean composition. So as a result of that, the background has actually changed a little bit of spatial compression, and I was able to avoid getting all the windows in the shot. So here's a picture. There's my daughter. She was helping me that day. And the reason I'm using this photo is I just wanted to show you what space, this beautiful space that the people said would be great for photos. And there's actually a lot of direct sunlight. There's windows. There's a door. It's a very industrial looking door. Not the kind of thing you want in your photograph. But by backing up and getting farther away from the people, I was able to maximize the little space that we did have and use that as my background. And how did I do that? By getting really far away. And so I tried to get a shot to try to illustrate just how far I am. I am way on the other side. My daughter is, she's probably about 20 feet away from the people, and she's holding a flash in her, she was holding a flash in her hand just before everybody started walking away. So that was an example of a challenge that can only be solved by, let's see what my next photo is. We're not going to talk about that. So there is an example of something that can be solved by understanding how perspective works and understanding that if you back up, you can change what's in the background. And you could change the size of what's in the background. And you'll see a lot of photographs of models or even scenes in movies where the background is completely blurred and there's a lot of spatial compression. And those people are really far away. The cameraman is really far away when they're getting those shots. And many times we have photographers come here to Fanshawe College, and they go into our studios and they comment on how our studios are too small. They should be longer so that when the need arises, you can get far away from your subject instead of always having to be so close. And why do they say that? It's because they're thinking about perspective. Anyways, that is it for perspective. I hope that had some aha moments. There's an element of this that's a little bit like, all right, that's pretty obvious. But I think there's a little bit more going on, and it's just should leave you with some things to think about. Actually, here's an example. When you go to lighting techniques, if you ever show up to your class with a wide angle lens, I don't know who you have for lighting techniques, but your teacher might say to you, go back to photo lens and get a different lens. Go get a telephoto lens, get a 90, 100 millimeter, 80 millimeter, something that's a longer focal length. Not because there's anything special about that focal length, but because it's going to force you to get further away from whatever it is you're photographing on the table, just to make the shape of objects look a little bit more natural. And another advantage is by being further away is now you can bring in reflectors that can get a lot closer. You have less background to worry about. The further away you are, this illustrates that being further away means there's less background that is actually included in the shot. So a lot of reasons to think about this whole concept of perspective and moving away from your subject. Anyway, that's it for perspective. There's going to be some questions on the final exam. Make sure you understand spatial expansion, spatial compression, and what we mean by normal. And there will be some questions where I'm going to ask you, is this photo an example of spatial compression or spatial expansion? And know what causes the change in perspective. Anyway, that's it for now. Don't forget to watch the other video where I talk about normal lens and crop sensors and things like that.